favorite movies of all time is this movie called Cloud Atlas. You've probably never seen it, but it's this really trippy movie that takes place over like 6 or 7 different timelines, but with the same characters over thousands of years. And at the end of the movie, there's this really powerful scene where a young man is speaking to his father-in-law, and he says to his father-in-law, who owns slaves, that I'm going to join the abolitionists. I'm going to help end slavery. And his father-in-law is incredibly frustrated. He does everything he can to change his mind, tells him that he's a total failure, he's throwing away all of his opportunity. And at the end, his kind of last-ditch effort is telling his son-in-law, you are going to do nothing more than be a drop in the ocean. And it's at this point that my favorite line maybe in all of movie history is said, this son-in-law looks at his father-in-law and says, and what is an ocean but a multitude of drops? Sometimes it can feel like living this mission that Jesus has for us, this mission of becoming love and bringing more love and justice and good into the world around us can feel like really hard work. And that's because it is really hard work. Sometimes it can feel like hard work because the problems can feel so big, so huge, so immense that we can't really have a big impact. You know, what good can our one life do in problems that feel like they've been around for generations? But here's the truth of the mission. Sometimes one small act of love can have infinitely big ripples. There was a disciple named Peter. And Peter was actually the first disciple that Jesus called. And he was a simple fisherman. And Jesus said, come follow me. And Peter just dropped his nets and followed. And Peter was spunky. He always volunteered for what Jesus wanted someone to do. He always raised his hand when Jesus asked a question. Know anybody like that? Because I do, and they're kind of annoying. And even while Peter did a lot of the right things and was always trying to answer the questions, he was also a lot of times a giant disappointment. I mean, he was kind of a teacher's pet, and when he did raise his hand, he usually got the questions wrong. He had tried to walk on water and failed. He sometimes would get reprimanded by Jesus. Like Jesus one time called him, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter was a ringleader of the disciples, and he was also kind of a big disappointment. And there was no greater disappointment than right before Jesus was killed. Jesus had pulled Peter aside and said, hey, Peter, you're going to deny ever knowing me 3 times before I die. And Peter, being the teacher's pet that he was, he looks at Jesus and he's like, Jesus, I will never deny you. I am your person. I will follow you to the ends of the earth. I'll go wherever you want me to go. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I would never deny you. And Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times before this is all over. Well, fast forward a couple days and Jesus gets arrested. And while he's sitting there standing trial, Peter is in the next room, kind of out in a courtyard. And 3 people come up to Peter and they're like, hey, you're the disciple. You're the guy who is following this dude. And Peter's like, no, I've never known this guy. I had nothing to do with him. Don't arrest me. 3 times he does that. And at the end of the 3rd time, he looks at Jesus and Jesus is looking at him. And all of this shame, all this guilt, all this disappointment just floods over Peter. He runs as far as he can and as fast as he can, feeling like the greatest disappointment the world had ever known. Now this is where the story gets interesting. Because 3 days later, after Jesus had been crucified, these 2 women go to his tomb to prepare his body. And when they get there, the stone is rolled away and Jesus isn't there, but there's an angel there to meet them. And the angel says to these 2 women, go back to the disciples and gather all of them, and we're going to go to Galilee where Jesus is going to meet you. And this is important because the angel says to the women, go find the disciples and Peter. In some versions of the Bible, it even says, go find the disciples, especially Peter. And I think this one little word says huge things about Jesus' love. Jesus wanted to make sure that Peter still knew that he was invited. Peter is sitting there by himself, feeling sorry for himself, feeling like a disappointment. He's ashamed. He's guilty. He feels like he let Jesus down in a way that he'll never be able to make up for. And Peter is probably at this point not even feeling like a disciple. So the angel says to the women, "Go find the disciples, especially Peter." Jesus wanted Peter to know more than anybody else that he was still invited, no matter how disappointed he felt like he was. No matter how guilty or ashamed he felt, he wanted Peter to know he was still worthy of following Jesus. That's not a big act. It didn't draw headlines. No one was really talking about that. It was just one small word in the Bible. But it changed Peter's trajectory. That one small act changed the history of the church because Peter, knowing that he was still included, became the first pope. He became someone who started churches all over the Roman Empire. One small act changed Peter's life. Now we're here outside Peabody Elementary School down here in St. Louis. And this is one of the schools that we partner with for the Literacy Project, which just means that every day, mentors from the gathering are coming down here and spending 45 minutes working with young elementary school students, working on developing reading skills. And that might not seem like a giant ask. Like, it's just 45 minutes once a week. What kind of impact can that really have? Well, the impact might be miraculous. It's an impact that we might not ever see. You know, our mentees, these students might forget our names, but they will never forget that there was someone who showed up and loved them, who smiled with them, who laughed with them, who read with them, who played with them. Sometimes small acts can have giant ripples. Sometimes living the mission doesn't mean that we're going to get showered with headlines. Maybe no one is going to blast us in their Instagram stories or on their Twitter feeds telling the world about how great we're doing. That's not really the point. Sometimes we're not solving all the world's biggest issues in one fell swoop. Sometimes love, living the mission, showing grace and peace to the world means just showing up. Sometimes it means things that people will never recognize and will never get credit for. Part of living the mission is loving the people around us in small ways, knowing that the impact